So I want to welcome you to the Yale Broadcast Center. My name is Robin Hogan. I'm the Deputy Director of Public Affairs at Yale. And this is a first for us. We've never used this wonderful new facility to tape a program that will be broadcast on the Discover magazine website. The John Templeton Foundation is underwriting this program tonight very generously, and a series of programs like this all over the country on the theme of the big questions, posing the big questions. They have a wonderful brochure of essays on this topic, which we'll be distributing at the reception at the end of our program. Now, our moderator tonight, we're delighted that Cory Powell, after spending 4 years in that dreadful town up on in Cambridge, Harvard University, has decided to
it passed like a dream.
To see the light and to come to New Haven tonight to moderate our panel. Cory is the editor-in-chief of Discover magazine, who many of you know is the nation's leading general interest science and technology magazine. During his 11-year tenure at Discover, Cory has moved through the ranks of web director, news editor, features editor, and executive editor to the top of the pecking order as editor-in-chief. We will forgive him for wasting those 4 years in Cambridge. His areas of expertise include astronomy, space exploration, alternative energy, emerging diseases and environmental toxins, climate change, and the topic of this evening's broadcast, evolution and creationism. Cory, welcome to New Haven. We're glad you saw the light.
First of all, I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank the Templeton Foundation for joining in this event, and especially for our three panelists. Three marvelous and really free-thinking people here who I think are going to kind of frame this discussion in ways that I hope are a bit different than the way you've heard it framed before. One of the things that kind of intrigued me about this event is, at Discover, we regularly get reader mail from people who accuse us of having an atheistic materialist agenda. That we push evolution, we push global warming. We're part of this cabal of hard materialists with this secret hidden agenda, and then we're co-sponsoring this event with the Templeton Foundation. And I know from Gary Rosen, they hear all the time from people who say, "You've got this secret, spiritual, religious event, agenda. You're trying to, kind of push religion into all these debates." It tickles me in some sense, but there's actually sort of a more serious agenda here, which is that, I think people tend to think of these questions in polar terms, in simplistic terms. There are actually some interesting evolutionary reasons of why people might do that. What I'm hoping to do here is really, address this big question. Does evolution explain human nature? That's talk about a big question. I mean, that's something that's way more than we can possibly chew off in the course of an hour-long panel. But I think there are three perspectives here that I think will help make sense of this question. So let me start by actually just kind of framing the question in slightly more concrete terms, because I think human nature is such a big idea. It's such a big term. I think most of us at a sort of a common sense level identify there are certain things of human nature that we think of as being the most human. Consciousness, free will, and morality. And I think the conversation that we're talking about here is kind of going to frame human nature in those terms, not entirely defined in those terms, but that's sort of the focal point of the conversation. I'm going to ask each of you to kind of introduce yourself quickly, give your affiliation, describe your work, and just give me quickly kind of your perspective on this question of does evolution explain human nature? I'm probably not expecting a yes or no, but although I'd welcome a yes or no. But sort of what your research is and sort of what perspective it gives you on that question. So let me start with Ken Miller.
Well, my name is Ken Miller. I'm a cell biologist. I work on biological membrane structure and function, but I have broad interest in biology, as an awful lot of people who teach and write about biology do. I'm the co-author with a terrific guy named Joe Levine of a whole series of high school and college general biology textbooks that are used all over the country. These textbooks have drawn me into public arguments about how the theory of evolution is taught, presented, and understood. It gave me the honor, although I'm not sure that's the right word, of being the lead witness in the Kitzmiller versus Dover intelligent design trial in federal court in Pennsylvania in 2005. And I've also written on the interface between science and religion. I've written a book called Finding Darwin's God, a scientist's search for common ground between God and evolution, arguing that in fact there are ways that religious people can understand the evolutionary process. So I'm broadly interested in evolution, and very much interested in communicating science to the public and promoting general public understanding of science.
Okay, wonderful. Our second panelist tonight is Laurie Santos, who I'd say has maybe a sort of a more integrated view of biology. You want to talk about what you do?
Yeah, so I'm Laurie Santos. I'm a professor of psychology here at Yale University, and I actually try to study the evolutionary origins of human nature. So I'm really kind of ingrained in this question, as it were. But I try to look at it from a slightly different perspective than you might think. I actually try to take a slightly comparative look at human nature, try to see what can we really understand about human nature by studying our closest evolutionary relatives. So we're trying to look at what aspects of human nature do we actually share with non-human primates, and which aspects are actually different. So I really try to take a more of an empirical approach to trying to get at this question, and that's kind of the perspective that I come to it from sort of thinking about humans from the perspective of what do we share and what do we not share with non-human primates.
Okay, and then I think sort of broadening the canvas further, we have David Sloan Wilson.
I'm David Sloan Wilson. I'm an evolutionist from Binghamton University, and I study evolution not only in the biological sciences, but with respect to all things human. And I'm quite passionate about the fact that evolution is so very relevant and needs to expand beyond the biological sciences. I do this in my own work in addition to programmatically. I've started a campus-wide program on this subject. And two of the subjects that I work on, which I'm sure is going to come up here, is in the first place, individuals versus groups, altruism versus selfishness, which is so much concerned with morality. And in the second place, there being more to evolution than genetic evolution, that culture and also some psychological processes count as evolutionary. And therefore, and that has consequences for how we think about human nature.
You actually let me pick up quickly on something that you just mentioned, morality and specifically altruism. Things that we think of as quintessentially human, if not uniquely human. Where did altruism come from? Is altruism a distinctly human trait, and is it an evolved trait? Where did it come from, and what is the utility of it? If it's something that's not sort of imposed from top down, where could altruism have come from?
I think I can give a 1-minute history because I know time is short. But basically, the reason that altruism is so puzzling to the evolutionary imagination is that it is disadvantageous. It is locally disadvantageous. If you put an altruist and a selfish individual next to each other, the selfish individual wins. We hope altruism evolves, but if it's locally disadvantageous, how can it evolve in the total population? And the answer is that it's advantageous at a larger scale, that groups of altruists and solid citizens of all sorts can survive and reproduce better than groups of individuals that are not so altruistic. And this very simple formula applies throughout nature. So the first answer to your question is by no means is altruism defined in that way confined to humans. And in the second place, humans practice altruism in addition to selfishness with a vengeance and among non-relatives, perhaps more than other species. So our altruism is distinct. But what's so very interesting about altruism is that it's such a fundamental issue for all social behaviors, all creatures, all social behaviors. And so there's a big stage in which we can examine the large but still smaller subject of altruism in humans.
So that naturally leads me back to Laurie Santos, who actually is looking at non-humans. What do you see? Do you see altruistic behavior, and what does it tell you about the difference between human altruism and altruism in other species?
Well, it's a puzzle, right? Because on the one hand, other primates are pretty much just as social as humans, right? They have all the same sort of evolutionary puzzles that being a social organism poses for you, but you don't see the kind of non-kin altruism that you see in the human species so robustly. Humans are just nice to non-kin anonymously. We're willing to do all these wonderful things. We donate blood, we go into the military, we give our lives, do all these things. You just don't actually see primates doing that. And so the empirical question that primate researchers are starting to face is, well, why is that? Are we just not seeing the right kinds of things, or can we actually see some sort of altruistic behavior actually playing out? And the empirical answer right now seems to be that it's a complicated and difficult to get at kind of problem. Some primate species seem to show behaviors that are very altruistic. So they're really willing to take a cost to themselves to actually do things that are fair to others, to do things that help others. But it's not true of other primate species. So some species do, some species don't. And it seems like it's an unfortunately complicated problem right now that we don't have a great grasp of. But David really nicely stated the problem, which is that all social species actually face this issue of they would do better if everyone was kind of nice. But it seems like humans perhaps uniquely have some proximate mechanisms to actually do this nice behavior. So it's a bit of a puzzle, both kind of theoretically and empirically right now.
Well, let me actually follow up with that. I mean, because you're doing specific studies. I mean, what do you see when you actually kind of boil this down to a specific experiment? I mean, how do you study altruism? How do you actually look at the primates, and what kinds of behaviors do you see? What's uniquely human, and what seems to be more general?
So I'll give you the actual practical kind of data that we see in the lab that we're trying to make sense of right now. So my student Christy Limegruber has actually done this wonderful study in collaboration with Franz de Waal, where she said, at no cost to themselves will a capuchin monkey, who's a New World monkey, kind of relative of humans 35 million years ago, will they do something nice for someone else? So if I was a capuchin monkey, I'd have the opportunity to actually give food to Ken. I could choose to give food to him or not give food to him at no cost to myself. So what do? And it turns out that capuchins are nice if they have the opportunity to be nice. So if you're looking at me and I see you, I'll actually give you the food. But as soon as I no longer see you, and importantly, as soon as Ken no longer sees me, then rather than just kind of not being nice anymore, I get very spiteful. So rather than do something that is nice to you, I actually do something that's actively mean to you. And so here are the kind of findings that were coming out in the primate literature, where it seems like on the one hand, I care about being nice to Ken, I care about what Ken thinks of me. But then on the other hand, it's slightly more complicated than that. It seems like under some situations, primates are actually nice, but under some situations, they're actually kind of mean. So it gets very complicated in terms of the empirical answer to some of these kinds of questions.
So Ken, I mean that sort of naturally, you've been deprived of food or something's happened to you over here.
Well, Laurie gave me some food at dinner tonight.
Right, that takes some of the sting out of it. No, I'm actually curious. I mean, you were in sort of ground zero of a lot of these debates. You mentioned the being at the Dover trial.
Sure.
The proximate issue at hand in the Dover trial was intelligent design, but I feel like, the deeper issue in a lot of these debates between science and creationism or science and intelligent design, I think really is this issue of morality.
I think that's right.
Yeah, the idea that science is sort of materialistic and amoral, religion is spiritual and moral, and that I think there's this very kind of schematic argument that then develops that you have to choose between those two. But that's not exactly the argument that's not the perspective that you were presenting at Dover. Can you sort of talk a little bit about sort of the perspective that you brought to that trial and sort of how it relates to what we're talking about?
Well, the Dover trial had a lot of very specific issues that are really outside of the purview of what we're talking about tonight. And in particular, what had happened was a school board in Pennsylvania had decided to require its teachers to prepare a curriculum on intelligent design. Teachers refused to do that. School board, believe it or not, wrote their own intelligent design lesson, had it read to the students. That's the sort of thing that the 11 parents in the district objected to. They filed a lawsuit. So when the trial opened, my job, in a sense, and I spent the first 2 days of the trial on the stand, was to explain what the basis of evolutionary theory was, what the evidence was for evolution. I also knew that expert witnesses for intelligent design were going to follow me. And therefore, I had to explain to the judge what they would say, what their reasoning would be, and then why it was wrong in advance of them coming up. Because trials are not debates. You have to present your case first. And I knew I wouldn't get to follow them. And obviously, I and the other witnesses on our side did a good job of explaining to the judge what he would hear from the other side and why it was wrong. And he certainly remembered those lessons and wrote an absolutely extraordinary decision that intelligent design wasn't science, that it was primarily a religiously motivated doctrine, and it could not disentangle itself, his words, from its creationist roots. But to me, one of the things that I'm always amazed at, perhaps I shouldn't be, is the intensity with which many people will resist any mention of evolution. And it's because, just as you mentioned, to them it robs their lives of meaning and purpose and value, and it disqualifies any notion of morality. As if when you say that we are creatures of matter, which we surely are, that we were shaped by evolution, which we surely were, that evolution produced our bodies, it produced our brains, and I think in many respects evolution produced our minds. Therefore you say there's no such thing as morality, there's no such thing as right and wrong. Well, I don't think that follows at all. And I think it doesn't follow for a lot of reasons. In a way, what the evolutionary process does is to explore solutions to the world around us. One solution is to be small, metabolize quickly, and grow quickly. That's what a bacterium does. Another solution is to be big and sexy and photosynthetic. That's what an oak tree does, although you may not think of an oak tree as very sexy. And another solution is to have a large, highly developed, highly adaptable, and programmable nervous system. And in a sense, that is our solution as well. And I'm perfectly at home with the idea, and I think most biologists who work in the evolution of human behavior are at home, with the idea that the evolutionary process has shaped our moral sense. That the process of kin selection, which is one of the ways in which altruistic behavior is generally assumed to have evolved, that this process has given us a sense of what's right and what's wrong that helps to shape our behavior. Now, you haven't asked any of us directly to answer that question, which is, does evolution explain human nature?
Don't worry, I'm about to get there.
And my quick answer, and I'll leave it open for the other panelists, would be that evolution, yes, explains human nature, but it doesn't explain all of it. And I think that's a good point for me to stop talking.
Okay, well, let me follow that line through, and then I want to follow up on a couple things you said. Does evolution explain human nature?
Yes.
In the up or down?
And possibly all of it, but not yet.
David, does evolution explain human nature?
Only when you appreciate that there's more to evolution than genetic evolution. And when you do, and when you appreciate that individuals are evolutionary outcomes and that cultures are evolutionary outcomes, then it's also the case that as unique products of evolution, individuals have natures and cultures have natures that are different from each other. And so the idea of a universal human nature is only true for a subset of traits, those traits that are really part of our innate genetic repertoire. So what's so interesting about thinking of other evolutionary processes is that it enables us to say that as an entire species, we do not have a single human nature, for the very reason that cultures and individuals are outcomes of their own evolutionary processes.
That's a great thing to follow up on, because I think the idea of sort of nature red in tooth and claw, the kind of like the sort of like the classic competitive view of evolution is still a very prevalent way of how I think lay people, even a lot of scientists, think about it. Evolution as a one-on-one competition, or maybe like a sort of a small group versus small group competition. But what you're talking about is sort of kind of a multi-layered view of evolution. Can you talk a little bit more about how does that actually play out? What does that mean in terms of evolutionary dynamics?
There's a lot to say in a little time, but one of the points I want to make is that one of the most important developments in evolutionary theory is called major transitions. And what major transitions tells us is that, as amazing as it might seem, that the individuals of today are the social groups of past ages. And the first person to develop this theory was Lynn Margulis, and you might very well know the theory of the symbiotic cell, that the nucleated cell did not evolve by small mutational steps from bacterial cells, but as groups, communities of bacteria becoming so integrated that they become an organism in their own right. And much more recently, I think what's emerging, which solves a lot of problems about our human uniqueness, is that human evolution represents a major transition. And that's why we're so much more cooperative, basically, than, although cooperation certainly exists in other primate species, the reason we're so much more cooperative is because this transition happens. And what a transition is a shift in the balance between levels of selection, so that whereas before there's like plan A and plan B for how to succeed. Plan A is succeeding at the expense of your neighbor. Plan B is succeeding collectively as a group compared to other groups. And a major transition is basically a suppression of plan A, so that plan B becomes the main force in evolution. Now let me just make one slight more point, because the idea of morality from an evolutionary perspective is not just being considered by us evolutionists, but it's also being considered by the best moral philosophers of our time. And one book is called The Evolution of Morality by Richard Joyce, who says this: if altruism was purely instinctive, it wouldn't even count as moral. We would not recognize it as moral. What's so distinct about morality, human morality, is a sense of obligation, that we might not be moral, but we're obligated to be moral. And so that sense of human obligation, of kind of being locked into a system in which you're held accountable and other individuals make sure that you're accountable, that goes beyond instinctive altruism. And that kind of locked-in system, when you study it, is astonishingly similar to the kind of locked-in system that causes genes, for example, to obey themselves in individuals. The rules of meiosis, for example, which is the fair allocation of genes into the next generation, becomes like a moral rule, basically, a rule of fairness. And so the isomorphism between a human moral system in this more sophisticated sense, beyond instinctive altruism, and the kind of regulatory systems which cause individuals to function well precisely because selection from within has been foreclosed, is astonishing. And that's not even a comparison between humans and primates, as fascinating as that might be. That's a comparison between humans as a product of a major transition compared to other major transitions way back in the history of life.
But this raises the question of why in primates you don't see a shift from the kind of plan A reproductive success to the plan B reproductive success. I mean, in practice, they have all of the features that you should have for humans, right? They have extremely strong group affiliation, where their bond with their group, which they stay with for long periods of time, actually affects their success. So groups can outcompete other groups for food sources. They can outcompete other groups for access to water and so on. It's just unclear why the primates don't then have the shift. So the real question, I think, winds up being at the proximate level is, what are the kinds of mechanisms that allow for human altruism to develop? And why don't you see those kinds of proximate mechanisms playing out in the primates?
Yeah, and I think one of the things that, just speaking from the biological point of view, that melds into this, is if you read The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin, you can be struck by the fact that he confesses in 3 places that he just cannot explain altruistic behavior in animals. He talks about the social insects, he talks about cooperation between animals, and he flatly says, I really can't make any sense of this, because if behavior is inherited and is subject to natural selection, that behavior should favor the individual and should not favor someone else. So Darwin just says, as he did famously, because he was very honest about what he didn't understand, don't get it. Well, what happens, of course, in the middle of the 20th century is R.D. Hamilton, Robert Trivers, and others come along with a theory called kin selection. And that kin selection says that if you have an instinctive motivation towards altruistic behavior, altruistic means I help you at my own expense. I have a behavior that is a detriment to me but helps you. What they explain very clearly is if there's an instinctive motivation for such behavior, a gene for it, to put it crudely, that gene can succeed, even though it's to the detriment of my survival, if that behavior is directed towards close relatives, towards offspring or kin. That's why it's called kin selection, because it tends to favor individuals who might carry a copy of the same gene. It makes the group more successful. But the difficulty, as was brought up, is that humans in particular and many other primates display altruistic behavior to a much larger circle. And this is what I meant when I said I'm not sure that evolution explains everything about human nature, because this cooperativity is really there. Now, David has brought up the idea of evolution of social groups and evolution of culture, and there is no one human nature because there are many cultures on this planet. I tend to use a narrower definition of evolution as evolution in the biological sense. And to me, the notion of cultural evolution or the evolution of music or the evolution of political systems is more of a metaphor that uses the word evolution as opposed to evolution in the biological sense. So I think biological evolution gives us the tool, produces the brain, produces the instinctive behaviors, but we go further than that. We invent mathematics, we compose music, we write poetry. All of these things happen on the basis of the toolkit that evolution gave us, but I think they transcend the purely evolutionary explanation of human nature.
Okay, I feel like I have to let you
Yeah.
respond
Sure.
to that.
So a couple points here. This is science, right? Scientists disagree, right? So this is so very good that. And I would beg to differ with you with respect to just the history. And I think that Darwin actually perceived very clearly how altruism evolves on the strength of groups of altruists doing better than groups of non-altruists. But I really, at this point, want to segue to culture and focus not on Darwin, but on a forgotten figure among most people, and that is Pierre T.L. de Chardin. the French paleontologist who was also a Catholic Jesuit priest and who wrote the book Phenomenon of Man, which I'm sure you've read, in addition to other books. And I had the opportunity to read that book closely very recently and was actually astonished at how current it is, because it's not read by my colleagues at all. It's read mostly for its spiritual value. Anyone who reads it now reads it primarily for its spiritual value. But I was amazed at how current it was scientifically. And what Chardin did, I think, was absolutely extraordinary, because that book and his vision is 100% naturalistic. He does not invoke intervention anywhere, not for the origin of life, not for the origin of humans, not for anything. And yet, that book is just penetrated with spirituality, and he's using the word spirit and soul all the time. And the reason that he can do that is he says that what was amazing about human evolution was that it was the birth of a new evolutionary process. And that, for him, made human origins as significant as the origin of life, because the last time an evolutionary process had been created, it was the origin of life. Now we have some new process that had taken place, a variation and selection process. What is evolution but variation and selection? And so this was now a variation of selection of ideas or reflection, as he put it, but which is different in some respects, but in every other respect obeys the rules of evolution. And so Chardin, and I think this is really the way to go, so this would be a great debate we could have here and we can continue, is that cultural evolution is fundamentally like biological evolution, and we can get so much mileage out of that rather than thinking of it as merely a metaphor. And so I think that what we've identified here is a real debate point amongst the experts, right? So this is it, folks. State-of-the-art science taking place right in front of you.
No argument that cultural evolution is real. But my argument is that human nature is fundamentally biological and affected by the cultures in which we grow up. And for me, the notion of evolution explaining human nature is, in fact, that biological evolution. Culture is transient. You can adopt a child from one culture, raise him in another, he's in that other culture. And I think, for me as a biologist, the interesting question is how much of our biology explains that human nature? And the answer is a great deal, but not 100%.
Well, we have an empiricist right here in the middle.
Yeah, so jumping in as a psychologist, there's actually some common ground here, which is the question of, well, if cultural evolution is so powerful and it shapes human nature so much, why don't we see cultural evolution in other species? And it turns out that, again, the answer might actually be in the psychology. It turns out that it seems like some of the proximate mechanisms that you might need for culture, things like imitating, so I see you using your fork some way, or I see David using chopsticks some way, and I imitate that and then take that to the next level and give it meaning and so on. Those types of very simple mechanisms don't seem to be the kind of thing that other primates can do very well. It seems like even though the old adage is that kind of monkey see, monkey do, in fact, monkeys don't see and do. They just don't seem to have the wherewithal to kind of copy others, whereas humans do this to a fault. And in fact, there's some lovely developmental research showing that if a human child sees a human adult doing a behavior that's actually just wrong, that's actually just not a good way to do things, they'll actually copy it, even though they're kind of getting the wrong result. And what it seems like is that this kind of behavior of copying, some of these mechanisms that might drive culture, like imitation and so on, are so powerful that they might bring human children to the opposite result. The cool thing is that primates actually don't show this, but that might actually explain why you see cultural mechanisms driving human evolution and the changes in human nature that you don't see. Now, these proximate mechanisms are completely agnostic as to the way these things play out once you have proximate mechanisms to drive culture.
Before I leave that point, I do want to follow up, because I mean there have been reports, certainly in the way they're reported in the popular media, of chimpanzee populations that differ from other chimpanzee populations in tool use, things that are popularly presented as evidence that actually certain chimpanzee cultures, certain chimpanzee populations actually do have culture. They do have transmitted cultures, or in dolphins also. But you're saying that those things are limited or are fundamentally different from what you see in humans?
The claim is that the mechanism in humans is just far more slavish, that the act of seeing a human behave in a way sort of drives another human to behave in that way. It actually changes their cognition of the problem. So there's this lovely study with chimpanzees done by Andy Whiten and his colleagues where they set up this little puzzle box for chimpanzees. And chimpanzees see this puzzle box, they don't actually know how to operate it. But if they were to see another human operate it, they could figure it out. They could say, oh, the human did this behavior and this behavior, I'm going to copy that exactly. Human children do the same thing. Now you just change the situation. So the puzzle box is sort of obvious. It's clear, and it's very clear to the chimpanzee and to anyone who looks at it how the puzzle box works. And now I see you as a human do some kind of crazy thing on the puzzle box. I, as a chimpanzee, say, I'm a very smart chimpanzee. I'm just going to do what I'm supposed to do. But you give the same problem to a human child, a 3-year-old, and they'll watch what you do and do it exactly the incorrect way that you did it. So it's kind of this cultural mechanism for driving the kinds of behaviors that are seen rather than the ones that you can kind of figure out on your own. So in terms of thinking of the balance of these kind of mechanisms, you might have mechanisms that say, well, I understand how physics works, I'm just going to sort it out. Versus I have mechanisms that say, a good thing to do is to copy what I see others do. And it seems like humans err on that side.
Yeah.
But the power of that sort of mechanism actually allows for this kind of cultural learning that we see robustly in human
But
cultures.
there are other animals. There are other animals that do what you sort of, to my unexpert eye,
Yeah.
what you said humans do. And the classic example I can think of is the song sparrow. And when a baby sparrow is raised in isolation, it has this little primitive song. In order to learn the full song of the adult, it has to be exposed to other adults singing the right song. And if it's only exposed to the songs of adults of another species, it will develop a defective song. So in that sense, it's sort of pre-programmed to acquire a particular song. And there's some very clever experiments in which baby song sparrows reared in isolation are presented with 4 songs from different species. And they have the capability to hear their species' song, imitate it, and learn a full song properly.
Yeah.
Now, doesn't that fall into the kind of imitation that you're talking about with respect to humans?
The idea is that if you had a kind of little sort of toggle switch on how much imitation you would do, that the human toggle switch, falls at 11, as it were. We're just so influenced by the kinds of behaviors that we see in others that we're really robustly able to imitate them and really have a drive to imitate them in a way that maybe other animals don't. Perhaps save songbirds, but at least across primates, you just don't see the kind of imitation that you see in humans. So you might get some sort of cultural traits that you see, some kind of ratcheting, but not nearly the kind of ratcheting that you see across human species.
Right, it's sort of a question of creativity and free will, and how much of that is uniquely ours, as opposed to something that's sort of that's shared with other species. And
So a few quick points. First of all, evolution makes use of anything that is reliable in the environment. And so if adult bird song is reliable in the environment, then baby birds will make use of that because it is so reliable. That's point 1. And that will be a form of culture. Point 2, we are living in the golden age of cultural evolution and studied in non-human species. So culture is more important in more non-human species, including creatures like guppies that you wouldn't think, not higher animals, but than we ever knew. Okay, but point 3, that's still a far shot from our kind of culture. Now, the 3 aspects of human uniqueness or specialness that we have been talking about, I call them the 3 C's: culture, cognition, and cooperation. There's a real tendency, this was also true of T.L. Hard as a historical note, to focus on our reasoning ability, our wonderful mental abilities as like the signature thing that has to be explained first, okay? And what's emerging, I think, and I think it's a rapidly emerging consensus, is that of the 3 C's, cooperation came first. And the special aspects of cognition and culture that we associate with humans are forms of cooperation. And just think of it. The human infant that I see an adult do something that makes no sense, but I copy it. There has to be a degree of trust in that society. So that's a sensible thing to do without any other information. And even though primate troops are trusting to a degree, members of a group are still their primary rivals. I mean, the males are still obsessed with being the alpha males, and the females are still being obsessed with being the top lineage matriarchy. And the competition among members of a group is sufficiently great so that you're not well advised just to do something that somebody else does, because there's not that degree of trust. And so the concept that cooperation is the first thing, and that everything else that's special about our species is a variety of cooperation. Think of it: language, symbolic thought, beliefs. None of these are private or individuals. All of these are traded. So I think that is simple to understand, but revolutionary, that we can say of these three C's, one of them came first, and the rest of them could be understood in terms of that first thing.
Okay, you touched on there toward the end. Obviously, one of the big issues or ideas hanging over this question, which is, when people talk about evolution versus human nature, religion or belief. I mean, that's kind of the elephant in the room. That's what drives a lot of the debate. That's what the way a lot of people frame this. How does religion and religious belief, how does that play out in the kind of the interpretation that you're describing here? Can religious belief then be described in terms of evolution?
May I go first?
Yes. Let me start out there.
Because I think it's I want to go first in part because I'm so deeply involved in this subject, and I can also thank the Templeton Foundation for investing in this for as long as they have. In a way that no other funding agency, there's no way that the National Science Foundation or the National Institute of Health is going to fund this kind of research. We hope that they do in the future. But over the last 10 years or so, the field of studying religion from an evolutionary perspective has grown into a respected and sophisticated scientific discipline that I'm very much involved in. And what's so exciting about it is that you can take the toolkit that evolutionists use to study genetic evolution, and it's extraordinarily how you can move it over to study a cultural phenomenon such as religion. So I'm once again returning to our point as to whether we can think of cultural evolution, in this case religion, as one aspect of cultural evolution, using the same toolkit that evolutionists use to study genetic evolution. And our time here is brief, but I look forward to continuing the conversation. I want to say not only yes, but demonstrably so in the case of the study of religion.
Well, so Ken, I want to let you respond in part because you've written about this and talked a fair bit about basically having your feet in two camps of having having religious faith and a very a clear-eyed view of what science can do at the same time. Does that split you in half? Does that make your answer sort of yes and no at the same time?
No, absolutely not. And I think that it's worth noting that 40% of the members of AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the largest scientific organization in the world, profess a religious belief of some sort. So it's not at all uncommon for scientists to be religious. It's worth noting that Darwin's first great proponent in North America was the Harvard botanist Asa Gray, who was himself a very devout Presbyterian. Theodosius Dobzhansky, probably the greatest evolutionary population geneticist of the 20th century, was also a Christian. So this is not at all uncommon. But the notion, and I think this is a bit what David was getting at, that the religious impulse, the impulse to try to come to grips with everything you see about you, with the universe itself, with human existence, with the sense of morality, in religious terms, it is hardwired into us. It's built into us. It gives us something that my friend Steven Pinker at Harvard has called a God module within the brain, in the sense that we tend to try to construct religious explanations for things. Do I find that reasonable and plausible in biological and evolutionary terms? Sure I do, absolutely. Do I find that disqualifies religion, therefore, as a serious explanation for these big questions? The answer to that is no. And the reason I would put it that way is if the very same process of evolution that gave us the God module, that gave us the tendency to look for these overarching and perhaps spiritual, otherworldly explanations for things, that evolutionary process also gave us a tendency to look for empirical and logical explanations and to like those. We call that science. It gave us an aesthetic sense. We call those aesthetic senses, we reflect them in art and music. So I think ultimately one cannot disqualify the notion of faith itself by saying that the religious impulse is produced by evolution any more than you can disqualify the scientific impulse by saying that it was produced by evolution as well. So I think ultimately we have to use those big brains that evolution gave us in a way that tries to make sense of nature, and we have to do it in a way that we think is sensible and logical and reasonable. And I think for many people, myself included, religious faith is part of that explanation that sits right alongside science and in many ways complements it.
So, there's an interesting dichotomy that you've described there. On the one hand, being able to think of even your your own attraction to religion as something that's produced, in basically a materialistic way through evolution.
Sure.
And yet at the same time, that the attraction to that explanation does not delegitimize that.
That's right. I mean, C.S. Lewis once wrote, "God likes matter; he invented it." And I think I think that's a very good way to explain why much of human nature has, in fact, materialist explanations to it. And ultimately, I think to be a scientist is to subscribe to a materialist paradigm, meaning the world of matter and energy and the laws of physics and chemistry are how we explain ourselves and our own existence.
But that's sufficient in a scientific explanation, but not sufficient to you in a personal sense.
Well, it's not sufficient in the sense you have to ask yourself, why does this world of matter and energy exist? Why is there something rather than nothing? Why is it that science works so well? What is there about the logical order of this universe that enables us to make sense of it? And you can simply say, well, it's just the way it is, not worth asking further. Or you can say that there's a greater explanation that encloses all of this. And I think ultimately, whether a person is a theist or not, you still have that question out there, which is, evolution gave us these big brains. Evolution gave us the consciousness we have. Evolution gave us the ability to develop the sort of culture whose evolution David has talked about. What does that mean in terms of the validity of these impulses? Is there such a thing as truth? Is there the good life, as the Greek philosophers used to ask? And I think ultimately, I think there are real questions to this. I think there are real answers to the questions of what is right, what is wrong. Is there such a thing in reality as good and evil, or are these two things actually just social constructions? I think those are real values. Mm-hmm.
Well, Laurie, I mean, you have an opportunity to actually think about this day to day. You're sitting on one side of the cage. Your subjects are sitting on the other side. Obviously, you think that there's some moral difference between the two of you, but you have a lot of time to think about this. What do you?
I mean, well, it's very hard for us to ask about the validity of the impulses, but we can definitely ask about the history of the impulses. And the funny thing about primates is that, obviously primates are not very religious. We don't see them praying out in the wild when we go study them and so on. But beyond that, they're just not very explanatory. Like, so the very simple explanatory drive that you see in any 3-year-old that's bugging you about why this, why that, we just don't seem to see that kind of drive in primates. They sort of take the world as it is, and they don't kind of go deeper to kind of find those explanations. So it seems like the explanatory drive just seems to be absent from them, which might be a reason why you don't see them thinking about the bigger kinds of validity questions about these sort of impulses, like the kind of things that humans do all the time of why are we here and so on, is not the kind of why questions they ask. So I think this question of where did this impulse come from, even in a very broader sense of just explaining anything, kind of scientific explanations as opposed to religious explanations, kind of why humans do that, is a big question, and it's unfortunately one that the comparative researchers don't have a good grasp on. It seems like other species out there don't do that. We do. Why we do is kind of a big open question.
Well, I mean, David, that seems like a sort of a natural segue to your work.
Why, David? Why?
I mean, obviously, the why questions, which are which start as can start as a very personal, individualistic question. I mean, the way it usually comes out is, it turns into a belief system. It turns into a sort of a group behavior rather than a sort of individual behavior.
Well, when you take culture and cultural evolution sufficiently seriously, you become a new kind of social constructivist. The old kind of social constructivist tends to be anti-evolution, basically saying, hardly anything comes from our genes, everything comes from our culture, so on and so forth. I want to say, you're right, but you need to be a sophisticated evolutionist in order to really understand the implications of that. So what does it mean that our cultures are so important that they really do dictate our behaviors in the proximate sense? Distally, of course, the genes are evolved. The genes, genetic evolution is required to explain the whole architecture that gives us the capacity to do that. But once evolved, there is so much that a human has to learn. That's why we have a stretched out life cycle, right? That's why we're not sexually mature until 16 or 18, whatever, because we have so very much to learn. And that whole system has to be so complicated that it's like the system of genetic replication and expression. So at this point now, we're talking about cultures as meaning systems in a very Durkheimian sense. That's another person that needs to be revised, basically. We're talking about cultures, groups, not individuals, and we're talking about very complicated meaning systems that coordinate our behaviors and so on and so forth. I think that thinking of meaning systems rather than religion per se, I think religion is a variety of the meaning system. And when you look at the importance of factual knowledge, I think factual knowledge sometimes contributes to a meaning system, and in that case we believe those facts. And when it doesn't, then we abandon those facts, no matter what their evidential content. So thinking of meaning systems, not religion, and the trade-off between factual knowledge and survival value for meaning systems, I think this is setting the stage appropriately generally so that we can now study religion, as large a topic as that is, as something smaller within that larger story of cultural evolution and meaning systems. And even though there's a tremendous variety of meaning systems possible, in fact, we could even say anything goes. We could imagine any meaning system might be produced, which was what a social constructivist might say. That's not true on the winnowing end. As far as what survives, the winnowing process for cultural systems is as strong and ruthless in a sense as for a biological system. And so the only meaning systems we have left to look at are ones that have survived a winnowing process and are therefore adapted to their environments in the same way as a biological species.
Well, let me ask you a question. I mean, jumping from that, if we come back to this question and sort of like frame human nature into these two sides, the scientific worldview and the non-scientific belief worldview. I'll try not to call it just specific religion in particular. It's actually easy for me to see how a belief system that really that knits a group together, that provides a shared identity. I can see the evolutionary benefit of that. I mean, viewed that way, it seems to me that that devoting your life to studying particle physics is kind of maladaptive. Like you're not going to have a whole lot of you're not going to have a lot of friends. You're not part of a very large community. I think maybe the question is, why does human nature include those kinds of scientific belief systems if they're not really helping you in that group sense?
Well, I would argue very strongly that scientific belief systems are not maladaptive. I've heard in fact, if you read just to
we've got at least a few people who are on board here.
If you read to use a trivial example, one of James Watson's, co-discoverer of the double helix structure, one of James Watson's recent books, and I think the name of the book is Genes, Girls, and Gamow. Watson sort of makes the argument that being a science nerd is a good way to meet chicks. And the argument here, I think essentially, is that people in science, whether they're the sort of astrophysicist nerd that you described or something like that, people in science have a deep intellectual curiosity. And it's very hard for me to believe that there's anything about having an inquisitive mind and a deep intellectual curiosity that is really maladaptive in any sense whatsoever. I think in many respects that's the determining character of the human species, and it's one of the things that has enabled us in biological terms to really come to dominate this planet, which we surely do as a species.
We've come to a great pause point in the discussion. That's this nice hermetically sealed discussion up here on the podium. The point where we can open it up to some, I hope, relatively well-adapted people out here in the audience who can respond, challenge, maybe open up the conversation beyond what we've done so far. I just wanted to, first of all, I really want to encourage people to ask questions, because I think this is it's a great wide-ranging group of people here, and a very nice opportunity to sound out things that we don't really get that many opportunities to talk about this way. There's one microphone over here. So I encourage people to come up, ask questions, and just want to put out the one caveat that we have cameras here. You will appear on camera. You may appear on the web. People might like you. You might get YouTubed. Who knows what'll happen? But
apparently increases reproductive success.
Yeah, in the broad sense, yeah, you may end up with
It's the first time I've heard YouTubed as a verb.
Yes.
And as a professor at a humble state university, I am prepared to be dazzled by the students at an Ivy League college.
Yes.
That great Yale University that we heard about in the introduction.
And as a product of the institution of Cambridge, Massachusetts, we'll see. I reserve judgment.
Well, hello. I'm Richard Prum, and I have my degree from Harvard, and my paycheck comes from Yale, so divided loyalties. I'm interested in exploring another aspect of evolution, and that is something that hasn't been touched on, which is that we focused both at genetic levels and cultural levels, on the force of, or the role of adaptation in evolution. But we haven't even recognized at all that there are evolutionary events that are coincident or contingent or accidental. One of the great concepts in this area is the idea of a spandrel, a structural feature that occurs because of architecture, which suddenly, because it's there, gets a use. And as Lewontin and Gould pointed out, the spandrels in San Marcos have these beautiful carvings on them. They weren't invented or necessary for the carvings once they were there. I'd like to hear the panelists discuss what aspects of human nature might be spandrels, and is there a role, what is the role for contingent and other incident levels, perhaps in explaining human nature, or why some of us might do particle physics and really enjoy it?
My quick answer to that.
You want to jump on
I
that?
can give a very quick answer to a contingent aspect of human nature, and that is the need to have vitamin C, drink orange juice. You might know that you don't have to force orange juice down the throats of your cats or dogs. They don't need it. And the reason for that is they are actually able to synthesize ascorbate from scratch. We, on the other hand, are genetic defectives. We have a broken gene for the synthesis of ascorbate, and that's a contingent event. And we share that not with all primates, but with some. So it's something that happened in our evolutionary history. It's good for the Minute Maid Company and for the makers of vitamins. That's an example of a contingent or chance event. In terms of spandrels, I will actually pick a spandrel that I think is an element of human nature that is absolutely essential to who we are, that was flagged as a spandrel by Gould and Lewontin, and that is language. And that is, one of their arguments is that the brain became very big and with a convoluted cortex for some other selective purpose. And the consequence of that hyperdevelopment of the nervous system of our brain was, in fact, the ability to manipulate symbols, make sounds, use those as symbolic meanings, and therefore develop language. So I would argue that I think the acquisition of language is itself a spandrel.
Agreement from the panel
Yeah,
on
that's a
language?
great question, and just to fire off a few quick answers. I mean, Gould performed a service, Lewontin and Gould performed a service when they emphasized that there's more to evolution than adaptation, okay? I think that if we want to say that what's most special about our species is a spandrel, lots of people do. I mean, that's a respectable position. I think it's actually a very tenuous one, because a spandrel, unless it gets worked upon and becomes an adaptation, in the case of language, almost by definition is not adaptive except by some happy circumstance. And so if you pin your hopes on what's most special about humans not being adaptive, well, good luck. But I think actually what's most special about humans is sufficiently valuable that it is adaptive. And then another point to make, I think, is that the concept of which you touched upon, of adaptations, traits that were adaptive in the past but not the present. Mismatch theory, basically. Vitamin C is one, but there is so much else. And there's really a sense in which, one of the first things you need to know about evolution is it only adapts you to your past environment, the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness. You change that environment even a little bit, a teensy bit, all bets are off. And what previously was a miracle of something working for you becomes a nightmare of something that's working against you, an immune system dysfunction. There's no end of examples of this. And I think there's cultural examples. I think when we look at some of the craziest things that are happening in modern life, it's our cultural system, which works well in a small group context, just doing wacko things comparable to the immune system dysfunction in modern life. So there's another example of the importance of non-adaptation, basically, for human affairs.
I mean, obviously, and people have talked about belief in God as a spandrel. That can fit in terms of belief systems, of something that turns out to be evolutionarily adaptive, even if it comes out of a sort of an accident. Would you view it that way?
It's an empirical question. So I mean, when I said that the toolkit moves over, what I meant to say is that there's not one evolutionary theory of religion. There's 6, because there's 6 evolutionary theories for everything. Is it adaptive or not? If it's adaptive, is it adaptive at the group individual level? Is it a cultural parasite? If it's non-adaptive, is it drift? Is it a byproduct? So on and so forth. So it's an empirical question whether a God concept is adaptive or not. And science goes to work when it answers those questions. But to give one piece of that, knowing that time is brief, one of the things that I'm studying is religious conceptions of the afterlife. and to focus on one that should be the interest of is the concept of the resurrection associated with early Christianity. I can report, I think it can be established that that is a cultural adaptation that arose in a certain time and place for a particular purpose. So in that case, and in many other cases, I think the way that the study of religion is going is that although it could turn either way, this stuff could be a spandrel or not, we are impressed by its adaptedness, basically, when we study them empirically for long enough.
Yeah, there's obviously easily another hour, perhaps a year of conversation that could follow here. I want to give other people a chance to ask some questions. So,
the question that this whole debate is being spawned by is, does evolution explain human nature, which is a very strong claim. So somebody who wanted to argue against this would just need to find one counterexample and say, well, here's a component of human nature, and it is not or cannot be explained by the tools of evolution. So for any of you who think that there might be some component of human nature that cannot be explained by evolution, I'd just like to know what is the counterexample that comes to your mind.
Should we start with actually, let me start with the primatologist here who does the hands-on things.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things that we do that are indelible stamps of human nature that we probably don't have a quick evolutionary explanation for. All the kind of cultural stuff. I mean, I think the problem with this kind of strong claim, and I think the reason that our moderator very kindly dodged it, is that there are different ways that we could talk about really explaining. Like, do we really want a full causal principle that explains all the very proximate facets of every aspect of human nature? I mean, any of us that were making that strong claim would get up here and look, I think, a little bit crazy if we tried to make those strong claims, right? But the way I think of the question of explaining is just, are we going to actually constrain the hypotheses that we have about some particular aspect of human nature, or does evolution actually kind of provide some insight that we wouldn't have gotten from a non-evolutionary way of thinking about it? So that's my way of completely dodging your hard question that I was hoping that no one would ask up here, but if other folks want to dodge as well.
Want to dodge it in a different way?
I would dodge it, but I'll answer it in a different way.
Okay.
And that is, I think what you're looking for is for someone to say, here's something that's in our nature that was somehow put there by some other force. I can't identify anything that to me looks like that. But here's the interesting thing. A computer operates according to Ohm's law. Does Ohm's law, therefore, explain the world of Warcraft? And I think the answer is no. Because the basic construction of the electronics inside a computer is what makes these higher level processes possible. So did evolution produce us, our nervous systems, our brains, and every aspect of our body? Sure. Does that mean it explains Riemannian geometry? Does that mean that it explains higher mathematics? The answer is no, I don't think so. Evolution is the mechanism that produced what we have. But there are elements of human nature that pertain to what we do with what we have that I think ultimately are not really explicable in terms of evolution, not because there's some sort of magical mysticism that was tapped into our bodies, but because there are things that we do that arise out of the evolutionary toolkit but aren't directly explained by evolution itself.
So, I mean, is that evidence of the divine, or is that just evidence of the limitation of what we understand?
No,
Different levels of analysis.
Yeah, just because someone's a Christian doesn't mean they're always making arguments for the divine. What I'm saying basically, what I'm really trying to defend, in a sense, is the integrity of reason, the integrity of human thought, which is to say that we are not simply the slavish products of evolution, where there is an evolutionary and adaptational explanation for everything we do. And I think I think reason is to be respected. I think mathematics is, I wouldn't say mathematics is pure, but mathematics is a very high level of reasoning, and I think it arises out of our evolutionary toolkit, but that doesn't mean it's explained by it, and that's the way I answer the question.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
You have another question in the wings?
Hi. I'd like to return to the morality point really quickly. You were discussing, I'm a neuroscience student. I started studying neuroscience here on a search sort of for objective morality within the human mind, right? So I was sort of convinced at the time that I started studying this that we would be able to find out somehow through science, like a means of objective truth. So we could say sort of, you're a human, you have these certain moral mechanisms within you, you're obligated because of that to act in a certain way. And in the past year and a half or so that I've been studying this and thinking about it, I've become less and less convinced that science as a descriptive entity can really do that. And so I was wondering if any of you that hold the opposite view, and I think maybe Kenneth Miller, you might. Do you think that there are any fields, or is there any mechanism or way for evolutionary biology or any field of science to leave the descriptive domain and enter into the proscriptive to actually give people a sense of obligation from scientific principles or findings, where in some given situation, however small, that they are obligated to act in a specific way.
I'll be glad to defer to my colleagues on this.
He asked you
I
specifically.
mean, is it okay to rephrase the question? Is there a scientific morality?
Sure.
So let me just sort of boil that down to the question: Is there such a thing as a scientific morality, or is there a moral code that's derivable through scientific inquiry?
I mean, my strong sense is that you can't get normative claims from the kinds of things that neuroscience can tell you. But
Well, the naturalistic fallacy tells us that values cannot be derived entirely from facts, okay? On the other hand, values must consult facts in order to come up with any prescription for how to behave. And so facts play an extremely important role in a value system, because if a value system just by itself can't do anything without consulting the facts of the world. And so that makes science by itself inadequate as a value system, but very important as a kind of a consultant for a value system. Morality, it seems to me, has an axiomatic definition, and when you read moral philosophy, I'm always a little bit amused that this is like so axiomatic that it's hardly ever questioned. Morality is fundamentally other and society oriented. It's just defined that way. Evolution doesn't define it that way. It's just any moral philosopher will just take it as a given. It's like mathematics. Is that something that's moral is something that's going to contribute positively to others or to society. And there's some very interesting exceptions to that rule. So I think that when you take everyone's definition of morality, and then you take the facts that science gives us about the nature of our species, which can be everything from neurobiological all the way up to many other levels, proximate, ultimate, and so on and so forth, then we have new facts, in fact, radically new facts, in order to consult with even a traditional value system.
And I'll give the short answer, which is I think science can inform us in the development of a moral sense, but I don't think science can determine morality.
Okay, we have another question here. Okay, yeah, and this unfortunately is going to be the last question of the evening, but fortunately, this conversation will live on online, and all three of these presenters here have been very active in engaging in debates and writing books and publishing articles. I mean, this is a debate and discussion that will live on far beyond this evening. But let me present our last question.
Sure. So there's this concept of organic intellectual, the idea of questioning our assumptions as scientists all the way down. And I'm wondering if there are any senses in which possibly Western biases have affected our thinking or even particular findings about evolution and cultural evolution, and if evolution has been over-applied.
Right.
Does that sound mean you want to start, or does that mean you don't want to start?
You want to have the last word? I'll go first.
Sure, go ahead.
Science is a human activity. All human activities are affected by the cultures in which they take place. And since science, as we understand it today, developed in Western Europe, transplanted to the United States, and then later on to Eastern Asia, it was affected by those cultures. So there's absolutely no question about that. Have certain ideas been over-applied? Has evolution been over-applied? All you have to do is look at the eugenics movement and immediately say, yes, that evolution has often been over-applied and over-interpreted. So I think it's almost a truism that the culture in which science develops affects the way in which that science is practiced. But I think ultimately what gives me faith in science is that science is a self-correcting activity, that there are ways to correct these excesses. You see them in anthropology, where the entire field has spent a decade and a half recoiling from the male perspective biases of the practitioners of this particular field, and now we have a correction going on in that and many other fields. And I think as science as a human activity spreads throughout the world, as the Eastern cultures and others become more actively involved in the scientific enterprise, they're going to provide whatever correction is necessary to the Western biases that are built into the science that we do.
Yeah. I'll
Laurie,
echo that completely. I mean, you see the same kinds of biases in the field of primate cognition. Funny, it's a gender bias as well, depending on the gender of the science studying the primates. But again, you see across time these sort of things correcting themselves. So unlike other kinds of systems, science actually have this self-correction mechanism in a way that we hope will ultimately figure this stuff out. But
yeah, I think, and I think there is. I mean, following up on that question, I mean, there is a natural tendency to, you know, when we talk about human nature, we think about morality. When we think about morality, we think about Judeo-Christian morality, which is what we're often, most of us in the room are dealing with. The religious battles with evolution are typically framed in terms of a very Western type of monotheism. It's sort of a natural place to end this conversation, since you think in terms of, you were talking in terms of.
Don't end it yet.
Of belief systems, defined in a way that's much broader than one particular
let me
belief
make
system.
a few quick points. First of all, everyone knows that Darwin and everyone else during that time was influenced by the assumptions of Victorian culture. And that's studied with a great deal of scholarly detail. We know in principle that the same thing must be true now, but it's very hard to study in an ongoing way. What there should be is a self-conscious field of science studies which takes place side by side and examines those cultural influences in a constructive way with the actual scientific process, okay? And that's something which hasn't taken place because science studies people are actually a little bit hostile towards science, it turns out. And so that kind of collaborative enterprise has yet to take place. Now, it's not the case that science is a self-correcting process unless there's a diversity of views within science. If all the scientists in a culture have the same assumption, then there's nothing in science to be self-correcting. And as a candidate cultural influence for our time, I would like to nominate individualism, the widespread assumption that individuals are a privileged level of the hierarchy, that everything can somehow be explained as a form of self-interest. I think that what we need are serious social historians to tell us why it is that individualism became so prominent, not just in evolution, but in everyday culture and the social sciences at roughly the same time in the middle of the 20th century, and how in many ways the formal scientific theories, such as the theory of individual selection in our field of evolutionary biology, is a tail being wagged by a larger cultural dog. And that this is something which is only now, in part because we're suffering from the consequences of individualism in our everyday lives and societies, now we're really beginning to question, as we need to, what is this axiomatic assumption of individual self-interest? What has it done and how true is it?
I think that's a wonderful place to end the conversation where now that we're done, we not only don't know the answer to the question, we don't even know what human nature is. I mean, kidding aside, I actually think that tearing down assumptions that you know the answer before you ask the question is one of the most important things that science can do. And that taking things, sort of stripping them down like this and trying to build up again is, if we're going to arrive at a meaningful answer and a meaningful sense of self-understanding, that's how we're going to do it. So again, I'd like to extend a very, very warm thanks to our three speakers tonight, who I think have just brought a really tremendous level of insight and sensitivity to the question, to the Templeton Foundation for making this possible, and to my employer for allowing me to do what I love doing, which is make a science magazine where we can talk about these things every month. And thank you all for being here.
Okay, thank you.